Chapter 7. The next morning, Dougal surveyed the contents of his life, spreading it out across his bed. The moleskin pouch containing his tools, picks, wrenches, flats, hooks, and skeleton keys, his knife, the few crumpled and tattered notes that he had made about Blim's tomb, a change of clothes, including a warm cloak suitable for sleeping in, a new sword, human-made and rough, inside a fine old scabbard, looted from some ruined temple in the Caledon forest, and the golem's eye, still bound in Colleen's handkerchief. Dougal packed light, as always. Everything he owned fit into a worn leather pack that he had with him since he was a youth in Ebonhawk. After his mother had died here in Divinity's Reach, he had gone to live with his father in the last human outpost in Ascalon, and his aunt Brenna had given him the pack to carry his belongings in. The backpack had long outlived everyone else in his family and proved trustier than any friend. The night before had been restless, and his dreams were plagued by the faces of the dead. Even while he packed, Dougal still considered the merits of bolting. All he would have to do was not meet Riona in front of Ascalon's mechanical orchestra, as they had agreed. All he had to do was slip out the front gates, or even hide elsewhere in the city. Perhaps go to ground in the Canthan district, where she didn't know anyone. If he ran, he knew that Riona would never find him, at least not in time. Turn left instead of right when he left his quarters, and he would be gone. He had buried Ascalon City deep, intent on never returning. Indeed, who would want to go there? The city was wrecked, first by the searing, then by the Fofire, its inhabitants reduced to ghosts, its walls surrounded by extremely possessive char, and yet he could feel the tug of failure, of the price paid, of things left undone. Dougal reached into his shirt, fished out the locket, and looked at it for a long time. He carefully undid the clasp and opened it to reveal a cameo, ivory set against jet, of Vala in profile. Its twin, the one with his portrait, jet on ivory, was lost in Ascalon, along with everything else. Dougal replaced the locket and carefully packed his gear into the battered backpack, and when he left the building, he turned right toward the meeting with Riona. A low, thin mist clung to the streets where the sun had not yet arrived to burn it off. Both Riona and Colleen were waiting in front of him at the feet of Ascalon's mechanical orchestra, a frozen explosion of giant horn bells at one end of the festival grounds. It was early, and the orchestra had yet to be activated. Its silence left the permanent carnival with an empty, lonely feeling. Bits of excelsior and other debris littered the pavement, and a few workers fitted with the heavy leather collars of criminals swept the remains of the previous celebration into larger piles. The two women were waiting but not talking. Colleen seemed interested in the construction of the clockwork in the orchestra, while Riona paced, her arms folded. The official representative of the vigil had regained that hard professional look that she had the day before. Dougal wondered how well she had slept the previous night, now that she knew for sure that the others were well and truly dead. "It's time," said Riona. "Let's go." She was just as sour as she had been yesterday, a thundercloud on an otherwise clear morning. Colleen, of course, was the sun. "This should be exciting," Colleen said. "The idea of a city filled with ghosts is just too intriguing. To my knowledge, no Sylvari has ever ventured into Ascalon City. I will be the first of my people to see inside the city's walls." "It's not that exciting," said Dougal. "More like terrifying." Riona grunted at him. "Surprised to find me still here?" Dougal asked Riona. She shook her head. "Thackeray's people have had an eye on your place all night, and you don't think I could slip past them if I wanted to?" She shrugged as if it didn't make a difference. "You didn't?" Dougal arched an eyebrow at her. "And you could have told Thackeray and his people that we had recovered something from the crypts after all." "Captain Logan Thackeray only tolerates me at best," Riona said. "Telling him that you had a gem would only have forced him to toss you in prison again. I need you in Ascalon City." Dougal slung his pack over his shoulder. "Then let's move." Dougal turned southward to the main gates, but Riona instead moved north towards the Ascalonian district. Colleen was left in the middle, unsure of which way to go. Dougal pointed. "Main gate to the city is this way." "We aren't using the main gate," said Riona. "Time is of the essence. We're going to use an Azura gate." Dougal walked back to Riona now, Colleen following and trying not to look like she was listening. "You didn't say anything about using an Azura gate," he said, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "Don't tell me you're afraid of them," said Riona, smiling slightly. "Of course not," said Dougal. "It's magic. I don't particularly trust magic. Worse yet, it's Azuran magic. They operate at such a level that even human spellcasters are still lagging in their wake." "You are afraid," said Riona with a tight smile. "You faced a city full of ghosts and God knows what else, and you're afraid of a magical gate. An Azuran magical gate," said Dougal. "There's a difference. half of the time they're taking it apart and putting it back together. And have you ever had one of them explain how it works? It's a simple immobile location dimensional transporter, said Colleen, that shortcuts normal reality by bringing together two fixed points with suitable equipment tuned to the same meta-vibrational etheric frequency. Dougal stared at her, and she added, "We have them in the Grove. The Azura were one of the first people we met when we appeared." "You have my sympathy," said Riona, and led the way to the Ascalonian district. Divinity's Reach was waking up. The people who worked for an honest living were shuffling off of their jobs, but laughing children still raced through the streets, darting from doorway to doorway in their carefree games. The Seraph patrolled the streets alone and in pairs, always on the hunt for innocents to protect and lawbreakers to bring to justice. Merchant's voice started to sound, hawking everything from apples to armor. Elders stood ready to train students in various specialties. Criers called out announcements from the Queen and news from both inside the city and beyond its limits. They passed through another set of walls built within the city itself to separate it from the Azura Gate. Dougal noticed the walls were patrolled by white armored members of the Seraph, armed with the newer smoothbore muskets. The golem's eye in his pocket felt suddenly heavy. They passed within the picket line without being challenged, and Dougal assumed that Riona's vigil authority extended to these watchmen as well, and that Logan Thackeray was delighted to get them out of his queen city. The gate itself was up on a low earth platform against the city's outer wall, a great stone loop filled with bronze pulsing energy. Even looking at the shifting surface of the gate opening made Dougal a little queasy. The area around the gate was filled with wagons and bearers, golem carriers, and a small group of soldiers in dark armor, Ebon Vanguard. Dougal remembered that the Ascalonian district had a hospital for the more badly wounded soldiers from the fortress city of Ebonhawk. Riona walked past and collected the wagons to a smaller group, mostly human, but with a couple of Azura and their golems mixed in. The Azura seemed unfazed by the crackling energy before them, but the humans apparently shared Dougal's nervousness. "Aren't we cutting ahead of people?" said Colleen. "Those are here to go to Ebonhawk," said Riona, pointing a chin at a larger group. "They have to tune the gate for the jump around noon. Requires a lot of energy. We're going to Lion's Arc." She looked at the two Azura arguing in front of the rune-inscribed pillar, bristling with crystals and levers. Dougal knew that the Azura gates were used by the diminutive race, and they would never risk their own lives for something that had not been mostly tested and safe. The gates were leagues upon leagues apart. Yet simply by stepping through the oval archways, they'd be at a similar gate in Lion's Arc. Still, the Azura's continual tendency to modify and meddle with their own work gave him pause. The two Azura in front of the plinth of crystals concluded their heated argument, and the older one of the two walked over to them. The younger stayed behind, shooting a sullen look at his elder. "Sorry," said the older Azura, a female. "Training day. My apprentice has his own ideas about the process of tuning two gates into alignment, and I have to beat some sense into him." She turned towards her sullen apprentice, who immediately brightened, and then returned to his black cloud of resentment as soon as the elder's back was turned. Dougal watched the younger Azura eye the arcane runes on the plinth and was concerned that the upstart apprentice would suddenly try to prove his point by changing the settings. "Papers?" said the Azura, and Riona presented a folded letter with a purple seal similar to the one that she had presented to Logan Thackeray in the jail. The Azura reviewed it, grunted, and said, "Are you carrying anything from Or, the Dragon Man, or any other territory that has been dominated or altered by the presence of the Elder Dragons?" She recited the question with the complete lack of inflection born of repetition. "No," said Riona. "Are you carrying any items that are illegal in Lion's Arc or Divinity's Reach? Are you entering Lion's Arc with the intent to commit any illegal actions or flee Divinity's Reach authorities?" Colleen started to say something, but Dougal quickly said, "No, we are not," and shot the Sylvari a look to indicate that the Azura really didn't want or need to hear about the Golem's Eye or their recent incarceration. "Very well," said the Azura, returning the document to Riona. "We should be ready to go in a few moments if somebody," she turned towards her assistant, "will stop sulking and tune the gate to its correct etheric frequency." The apprentice began to touch various runes and jutting crystals in order, and the bronze light within the archway turned a deep golden shade. One by one, the various travelers approached the golden glow and disappeared. Colleen stepped through without pausing. Dougal hesitated and looked at Riona. She made an "after you" motion, and it was clear that she wasn't going to leave him alone on this side of the gate. Mentally noting the lack of trust in these dragon-haunted days, Dougal stepped through. It was no more difficult than stepping through the surface of a soap bubble. One moment he was in Divinity's Reach, the rising sun just cresting the walls ahead of him, the city around him in deep shadow. The next moment, he and the others were in bright sunshine, leaving him blinking and raising a hand to protect his eyes. The air itself was different, changing suddenly from the cool, damp morning air to something warmer, fresher, and smelling of salt. The quiet energy of a city awakening was immediately stilled and replaced with the clamor of merchants, townspeople, work. One moment he was in Divinity's Reach, and the next moment he was here. Dougal did not want to think about where he was in the space in between. They stood on another low set of earthworks overlooking the merchants' district of Lion's Arc. Around them, in a slight arc, were other gates, some with golden energies in their arches, some bronze, and some a purplish hue. Next to them, 3 more Azura were squabbling about performance issues. Riona ignored them, passing Colleen and leading them down the steps to the Great Bazaar, following other travelers. The Lion's Arc of long ago was gone. Its only remaining memory consists of the battlements that survived the great waves from the rising of ore. When Zaitan, the undead elder dragon, brought long-sunken ore back to the surface, all lands surrounding the Sea of Sorrows were awash in great waves. Lion's Arc was almost utterly destroyed, and in its place was left a swamp of broken ships, snapped trees, and dead creatures. Out of that morass, the new Lion's Arc arose. Over the past 100 years, the town was reestablished by pirates and corsairs looking for a safe haven, and salvage crews reclaiming the flotsam and jetsam that had washed ashore. It soon blossomed into a cosmopolitan trading center. The city showed its recent origin. Some of the newer buildings were stone, but most of the city was of wood. The original structures were built from the remains of wrecked ships tossed up on the beach, and that architecture so defined the city that even new construction was built along the lines of hulls and keels as opposed to walls and roof. It was a scratch-built city, a lash-up made permanent, a temporary site that might yet outshine Divinity's Reach or the Black Citadel, or even the Azura city of Radisum. The people of Lion's Arc were as motley as its buildings. Before the rising of ore, it was a human city, a Crichton city. After the floods uprooted the houses and replaced them with shipwrecks, a transient population took hold, a brotherhood of the coast seeking nothing more than survival in an overturned world. The crews of the surviving pirate ships colonized the wreckage that was Lion's Arc, and their captains became the first leaders. As a result, Lion's Arc was ruled by a council of captains, and its morals and legality were always more flexible than in other great cities. The new population was also more diverse than anything else seen in Tyria. Here you found humans, but also equal or greater numbers of Norn, Azura, and Sylvari. The occasional bloated amphibian Hylic or hunched bucktooth dredge stalked through the streets. The cast-off of a half-dozen nations and a plethora of societies all gathered here. And Char, that was the part that concerned Dougal the most. The humans and the Char were still at war in Ebonhawk, yet in Lion's Arc, Char and humans lived, if not in harmony, at least within sight of each other without open hostilities. That was something Dougal, who had spent much of his youth hating and fighting the Char, had a hard time understanding. The term most people used when describing Char was feline, but beyond a few basic attributes, they were no kin to any cat Dougal had ever seen. They were huge, half again as tall as a man, not as massive as a Norn, but still towering opponents against a single human. Their faces were elongated muzzles, and their jaws were those of carnivores, filled with long teeth. Both males and females had 4 horns jutting from the sides of their skulls, the males boasting an impressive set, and the females a smaller pair on each side. Just behind the jawline, beneath the horns, hung 2 pairs of sensitive ears. The males had huge, hunchbacked and maned shoulders, while the females were more lithe and swift. They were no less deadly. When Dougal first came to Lion's Arc, he was stunned by the presence of the Char, including Char dealing with humans and other races. He had a hard time looking at them without thinking of the implacable foes who drove the humans for most of Ascalon and besieged them in Ebonhawk, the creatures responsible for the searing and the foe fire. He never dealt with them, preferring a Norn or a human merchant to a Char one when he could. Even when forced to talk to one, he could feel his skin crawl and the small hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The Char were legendary for their tempers and their violence, and he was unsure what would set them off. And while he was fairly certain that they could not smell his fear and unease, the Char were excellent observers, and his reluctance to deal with them was obvious. He would never go into the crypts with a Char, or want to be left alone with one. Now walking down the stairs into Lion's Arc's merchant district, he saw Char for the first time in over a year. None would come to Divinity's Reach any more than he would go to their main base, the Black Citadel. Already he felt uncomfortable by their presence, even though the leonine creatures seemed more at home here than he was. The Great Bazaar occupied a low spot surrounded by by hills near the center of town. Great posts were driven into the hills, and from those posts were strung rope riggings and lines. The entire web covered by sheets of sailcloth dyed blue. From above, the patchwork of sails looked like a choppy ocean, and from below, the cooler, sheltered market felt like it was cradled at the bottom of a shallow azure sea. Around them brewed and bubbled the population of Lion's Ark, engaged in the trade that was the lifeblood of the city. There were farmers from the estates to the north and salvagers from the southern bays and estuaries. Azura and Silvari squabbled over the prices of glowing floating platforms and weapons made of twisted wood and butterfly wings. Norn rolled through the crowds like bears fording a stream, and the char moved around, living their lives and ignoring 3 new arrivals, just like everyone else. "Colleen!" came a shout behind him. The Silvari turned, and Dougal along with her. Riona hesitated for a moment, kept walking. Wading through the crowd was a heavy-set golem, a crude creation of lumber and stone, as temporary as the rest of the city. A flat pane on its headless chest emitting a blue-green glow. One arm was much larger than the other, and both upper limbs ended in claws, making it look like a crude combination of a man and a fiddler crab. More important was the small Azura directly in front of the golem, who became only visible as the crowd parted for the larger golem, Clag, in all his self-involved fury. Dougal blinked and wondered if Logan Thackeray kept anybody in jails anymore. "Betrayer," said Clag. "You sold us out. You told the Seraph everything, and for this you're going to pay." That definitely sounded like a challenge, and an opening appeared in the crowd with Colleen and the 2 humans on one end and the Azura and the golem at the other. Dougal looked around and saw 2 lion guard in the crowd. They were curious, but neither was stepping in to take matters in hand. As long as the disagreement didn't threaten any trade or merchants, Dougal doubted they would. Lion's Ark was a good distance away from Divinity's reach and its vigilant seraph. Dougal stepped forward, hand on his sword, to stand beside Colleen, but Riona put a hand on his shoulder. "He's talking to her, not you," she said, clearly enough for the Silvari to hear. "This is her problem." "I don't see it as much of a problem," said Colleen. "I suppose you don't want to chat about this first?" she asked Clag. The Azura responded with a curse and pointed at the Silvari. Emotionless and obedient, the golem lumbered forward. Colleen dropped into a crouch, and bright green motes bunched and flamed from her palms, gathering into swarms of necrotic energy. She was too slow. The golem crossed the distance between them and smacked her hard with a limb, the thickness of a ship's yardarm. She stumbled to one side. The second arm punched her hard back the other way. Colleen lost her footing and fell to the paving stones. Golden blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. Clag had apparently chosen to invest in speed over raw strength this time. Dougal let out a shout, and shaking off Riona's hand on his arm, ran forward, drawing his sword. The blade came out roughly, catching the sides of the scabbard and threatening to pull it along with it. But he had gotten the sword out and closed in on the hulking golem. Clag shouted a command and the golem changed targets, wheeling quickly from the fallen Silvari and bearing down now on Dougal. The human reversed himself and danced backwards a few steps, the heavy arms swinging through the space where Dougal had been seconds before. The golem overextended itself, and Dougal lunged forward, driving his blade into the joint where the huge claw arm met the rest of the body. The blade dug deep into the juncture, and Dougal heard a very satisfying crack as he loosened the armatures holding the golem together. The golem flexed its shoulder back, trapping Dougal's blade, and with a sharp snap, crushed it in its joints. Dougal pulled back the shattered stump of his sword, stared at it for a moment, and cursed. The golem had regained its footing now. The smaller arm lashed out, its claw-shaped hand closing on Dougal's sword arm, and pulled him off the ground. Dougal let out a yelp as he dangled there, the golem drawing back its arm to deliver a blow that would knock the human into the Sea of Sorrows. Riona leapt in at that moment, her own weapon jabbing quickly into the gap into the construct's shoulder, held open by the shards of Dougal's blade. She was quicker than he had been, so that she pulled the blade out in a cascade of arcane spark, and the lethal arm hung there, its internal runes and spells grinding to regain control. Having gained the advantage, Riona did not hesitate, but instead struck against the golem's now exposed chest. The fragile pain of the golem's heart shattered at the blow, and elemental lightning spilled out in a shower of spark. Dougal twisted in the creature's grasp as the energies played out over its body. The vigil warrior was not done, and dropped to one knee and lashed out again, this time striking at the joints of the golem's knees. Another cascade of elemental energy spilled out as the crystals within were smashed open, with the skill of a surgeon with a scalpel. The golem froze up and let go of Dougal, who dropped a few feet to the ground. Then it pitched backwards, leaving a surprised Clag exposed beyond it. Stupid second-rate sword, said Dougal, looking over at Colleen, who was moving now, though not very fast. Dougal pulled himself off the ground, but Riona was still quicker than he was, and flung herself on top of Clag like an owl on a rabbit. Grabbing the Azura by the throat, she hefted him up and pulled her sword back to skewer him. Clag made a rattling noise, and his eyes were wide with fear. Now it was Dougal's arm on Riona's shoulder. Let him go, he said. She paused, and Clag managed to gurgle. She informed on us. I lost the golem's eye because she told the Seraph. You said. The rest of his words were lost as Riona tightened her grip around the slender windpipe. Gods, thought Dougal. He doesn't know about the eye. Not so smart now. Are you, little monster? Said Riona. You and the rest of your deformed race should be stomped out. We should skewer him right here. Dougal looked at Riona. Her eyes were angry, her jaw set, her words hissing through her teeth. She had changed since she was the voice of reason in their platoon. No. We have a mission, said Dougal, looking over to where Colleen was pulling herself upright. Don't let the little stuff get in the way. He's little stuff. Riona looked at Dougal, then took a deep breath and let her hand open. Clag dropped to the ground, gasping and clawing at his throat. Scat, said Dougal. We're done here. I don't want to see you again. Clag pulled himself up and shot a poisonous glance at Riona. He started to say something. Riona dropped into a battle crouch and growled at him like a char. That was enough. Clag spun on his heels and fled back into the crowd. Catcalls from observers at his back. Colleen stumbled up, rubbing her side where the golem had connected. Are you all right? Asked Dougal. Riona was still intently watching the place where Clag had disappeared. In a moment, she staggered over to where the fallen golem was, still sparking elemental essence. She knelt down next to it and for a moment seemed to be swathed in a greenish shroud. She placed her hands on the golem, and the last of its energy drained out of it and into the Sylvari. She stood up and nodded to the others. Better now, she said. She pointed to the golem and said to the crowd, Crap, the golem's body disappeared under a tide of opportunists. Dougal looked at Riona. What about you? Riona took some deep breaths and said in a low voice, It just seems that every time we turn around, there's some lesser race that is making trouble for us. I'm just getting tired of it. Dougal opened his mouth to argue, but looked at Riona's face. There was pain there, and something else, hatred. Instead, he said, We were going somewhere, right? Riona nodded and headed off across the marketplace without a word, Dougal and Colleen in tow. They emerged on the far side of the blue-tinted sails and found their way to a more permanent part of the city, where there was more stonework among the wood, although it continued with the nautical theme. Finally, she stopped at an innocuous-looking doorway. Riona knocked. A Hylic taller than Colleen opened the door, and Riona backed off for a moment, surprised by the wide, monstrous face. It was a frog-like being, in the same fashion as the Char were cat-like, bipedal, a great mouthed head topping a round, necklace body. Its eyes were wide and accusing. She gathered herself together and said, Crusader Riona Grady of the Vigil in Divinity's Reach. I have brought Dougal Keen for the General. The Hylic responded in a deep, raspy voice. Crusader Nagadal of the Blood-Tide Coast, also of the Vigil. Come in. I will announce your presence. They followed the Hylic into the hallway, and Dougal got a definite feeling that they were being let through a side door. Whoever Riona was working for in the Vigil, he or she apparently didn't want to make a lot of noise about their arrival. Dougal wondered how the Vigil would react to Clag's attack or Riona's sudden burst of temper. The Hylic led them into a small waiting room. They sat there. Colleen composed as if half an hour earlier she had not been assailed by a golem. Riona twitched and rubbed the back of her neck, trying to work out the tension. Dougal left them to their thoughts, for he had his own broodings. After about 15 minutes, the Hylic returned, and with a booming, "Follow me!" led them back out into the twisting hallway. Dougal figured that the Vigil chapter house must occupy most of the block, with numerous exits, probably access to the sewers as well. Finally, they were led into a large chamber dominated by a great table. Maps of Tyria hung from the walls, and the walls were lined with heavy cabinets. At the end of the room, a large figure stood before a fire in full armor, her hands clenched behind her back. When they entered, she turned and regarded them with sharp feline eyes. She was a Char, and for a brief moment, Dougal felt he could sense the hairs rise on the back of his neck, an instinctive reaction that he could not suppress. Dougal Keen, Colleen, born of the cycle of night, said Riona smoothly. May I present General Almora Soulkeeper, founder of the Vigil.